He raised the belt like it was a tool, not a weapon. The children didn't flinch. They were used to the sting. But when a stranger knocked with nothing but mercy in his eyes, their nightmare began to end. The scream wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It cut through the thin walls of the cabin like a knife, quick and sharp, and died just as fast. 8-year-old Sarah pressed her little hand over her brother Eli's mouth to keep him from answering. He was 5, trembling under the table where they hid, their bodies wedged behind a barrel of dry oats and the one broken chair their father hadn't sold yet. She could hear her older sister Annie upstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath hurried footsteps, and then a thud that wasn't furniture. "Say it again," their father's voice boomed, slurred and heavy from the bottle he hadn't let go of since dawn. "Go on, girl. Tell me one more time how I'm a failure." Annie didn't speak again. The belt did. Sarah closed her eyes and pulled Eli closer, curling herself around him like a shield that couldn't stop anything. Their hearts pounded in rhythm, matching the boots that stomped down the stairs moments later. They didn't have a mother anymore. She had left 3 winters ago, leaving only a pan of cornmeal on the stove and a letter that none of them could read because their father had refused to teach them. Said school was for fools and boys who wanted to be soft. They never saw her again. Sarah had learned early on not to cry, because crying got noticed, and getting noticed meant punishment. But Eli was new to it, still small enough to hope things could be different, still innocent enough to believe that a good answer might calm their father down. Tonight he had asked for bread, just that. One sentence, "Pa, can we have some bread?" That was all it took. Now, as the cabin door slammed shut and the heavy silence returned, Sarah counted to 20 before moving. Annie would be bleeding. Maybe worse. Their father had gone out again, probably to the saloon in town where he was known as the bitter widower who lost his wife and gave up on raising his kids. Most folks didn't ask questions. Some even laughed with him when he told lies about how ungrateful his children were. Nobody ever followed him home. Sarah crawled from behind the barrel and helped Eli up. His legs were shaking, but he tried to be brave. She reached for his hand and pulled him toward the stairs. "We'll be quiet," she whispered. "He's gone now." They climbed the stairs slowly. Annie was slumped in the hallway, one arm over her ribs, her cheek red and already swelling. When she saw them, she sat up straighter and forced a smile. "Didn't get the eye this time," she said, trying to make it sound like a joke. "Guess that's a win." Sarah knelt beside her and looked for the worst of the bruises. "We need to leave," she said, and her voice wasn't small anymore. It was tight, steady, like stone that had finally hardened. "Where would we go?" Annie asked. "Nobody wants kids with nothing." But Sarah had been watching the windows, watching the roads. And today, from the edge of the trees near the creek where she fetched water, she saw something new. A couple in a wagon, not old, not young, but something kind in their faces. They'd stopped in town, asked about properties for sale, and mentioned something about children. A couple that couldn't have any of their own. She didn't catch all of it, she was too far, but she remembered their names. Clara and Samuel Hoyt. And more importantly, she remembered where they said they'd be staying for the night. The empty shack behind the church, the one the preacher used to rent out before it burned in the back. No one else had touched it since. Sarah looked at Annie again, then at Eli. "We wait until morning," she said, "then we go." And they did. That night Sarah didn't sleep. She sat at the foot of Annie's bed while Eli curled in beside their sister. The belt was still hanging from the nail near the door, and the room smelled like smoke and liquor. Her father didn't return until dawn. She could hear him fall over the threshold and groan on the floorboards, but he didn't come upstairs. So they ran. It wasn't far, just through the dry brush and across the shallow ridge, but it felt like 100 miles with Eli crying and Annie limping. The shack by the church wasn't much, barely more than 4 posts and a roof, but Clara was outside sweeping the porch when she saw them. She didn't ask questions. She saw their faces, bruised, dirtied, silent, and opened the door. Samuel brought water. Clara brought blankets. Nobody asked their names until the 3rd hour, after the children had rested and eaten something warm. It was Annie who finally spoke. "Can we stay just for today?" Clara looked at Samuel. He nodded once. "You can stay as long as you need." But it wasn't that simple. Later that afternoon, the sheriff came by. He had heard about the children, not from the Hoyts, but from someone at the saloon. Their father had stormed in, screaming about runaways and thieves, waving a broken bottle and demanding his property be returned. Sheriff Bell wasn't a cruel man, but he was bound by law, and the law said children belonged to their blood, unless proof could be shown otherwise. Clara stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance with her small frame. "They're not going back," she said. Samuel stood beside her, taller, arms crossed. Bell sighed and looked past them into the dim room, where the children huddled near the fire. "I'll buy you time," he said, voice low, "but the father's not stopping." Sarah heard it all. She didn't need more time, she needed a plan. The next morning she was gone. Alone. To the saloon. To find the man who had beaten her sister and broke their lives, and to end it her way. Sarah's small frame made no sound as she slipped through the town's morning shadows. The saloon doors were half closed, the echo of a piano long since silent. Inside, the smell of whiskey, sweat, and old rage lingered like ghosts too proud to leave. She knew he'd still be there. He always was after a night like last. The morning sun hadn't yet reached the cracked windows, and through the haze of the smoky room she found him, crumpled on the floor beside an overturned chair, his boots off, his belt still in hand, as if the liquor had carved him into a sculpture of failure. His mouth hung open slightly, snoring through clenched teeth. Sarah's hands shook, not from fear, from something deeper, a kind of quiet desperation that children shouldn't know, especially not children who still had baby teeth. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. She didn't move closer. She didn't want to see him breathe. But the bartender saw her. Old Jeb had been wiping the same bottle for a year now, his knuckles stained from decades of spilled drink and spilled lives. He spotted her by the door and raised an eyebrow, but didn't speak. "I'm not here to stay," she said, her voice clearer than her age, "just to see." Jeb looked toward the heap on the floor and back at the girl. "He's your father." She didn't answer, just nodded once. "I've seen men mean," Jeb muttered, "but he's worse. That man treats the bottle like a Bible and his belt like truth." Sarah blinked at him, confused but unmoved. "You want him gone, don't you?" Jeb said, his voice low. "Want him out your life for good?" "I want him to forget us," she said, "or be too afraid to come looking." The barkeep leaned back, eyes scanning the doorway like he expected ghosts to follow her in. "Fear, a currency," he said. "Same as money, same as bullets. You don't got none of them, just your voice, so you best use it like a whip." Sarah nodded once more. She stepped closer to her father, still sprawled, still dead to the world. The man who once tucked her in before the drink got louder than his love. She stared at the belt in his hand. One day she would forget the sound it made. One day. She took the belt and walked out. Jeb watched her go, shaking his head. "That girl's got fire." She returned to the shack just after noon. Clara was waiting on the porch, hands wringing the edge of her apron, eyes lined with worry. "I knew where you went," Clara said. "I came back," Sarah said simply, holding out the belt. Clara didn't take it. She looked down at it, then at Sarah's face. "That doesn't belong in this house." Sarah nodded and walked around back. She dug a hole in the hard earth with her bare hands and dropped the belt into it like a snake too dangerous to leave in sight. She covered it with dirt, packed it with stones, and walked back inside without saying a word. That night they didn't lock the door. Samuel sat by the fire with Annie and Eli tucked beneath blankets, reading from a worn Bible with a voice that made the pages sound new. Clara baked something sweet, just flour, sugar, and old berries, and gave Sarah the biggest slice. But peace never lasts long in places where pain has grown roots. The next day he came. "Dear father." He wasn't drunk, not today. He was sober, and that made it worse. Sober meant sharp words. Sober meant twisted logic and rage that wasn't dulled by whiskey. He came with Sheriff Bell walking beside him, not because the law was with him, but because Bell was trying to prevent blood. "Those are my kids," the man said, his voice grating like sandpaper. "They belong to me." Sarah stood between him and the doorway. Her hands were behind her back, clenched. "We don't belong to anybody," she said. "You're mine by blood," he spat, "and by law." Clara stepped beside Sarah, then Samuel, then Annie, limping slightly but standing tall. Even little Eli, holding Annie's skirt, peered up at the man who used to tuck him in. "I'll fight you in court," their father said, sneering. "You'd have to prove you ever fed them," Samuel replied, calm and steady. The man's eyes narrowed. "Who are you to tell me how to raise my own?" "I'm the man who's never raised a hand to a child," Samuel said. "And I'm the man who's going to stand in your way." Bell sighed. "He's got no job, no roof, no care. The court will see that too, but until a judge rules, I can't stop him from trying to take them." "No judge will need to rule," Sarah said, "because he won't try again." Her father laughed, a dry, humorless bark. "You think you can scare me, little girl?" She stepped forward. "I'm not scared of you anymore," she said. "You can't beat a child who's already learned how to survive." Clara placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You'll leave now," she told the man, "or you'll have to answer to more than just God." For a moment he looked like he might try it, might push past them and grab Eli or Annie, but Samuel didn't move. The sheriff didn't move either, and the look in Sarah's eyes was no child's look. It was steel. He turned and left. 3 days later, the court papers came. Samuel and Clara had filed for guardianship. Sarah had testified. So had Annie. So had the old school teacher who once tried to help them and was turned away with bruises on her arm from the one time she stood between the belt and Sarah. The judge didn't hesitate. By the end of the week, Sarah, Annie, and Eli had new names, new clothes, a new place at the table. But it wasn't simple. Healing never is. Annie woke screaming for weeks. Eli flinched whenever Samuel raised a hand to wave or scratch his chin. Sarah didn't sleep unless she was closest to the door, watching, guarding. Clara taught them how to bake. Samuel taught them how to ride. There was a field behind the house that they turned into a garden. They built a swing from a tree. And slowly, Sarah laughed, not all at once, but enough that the house began to feel full. One night, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Clara found Sarah sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. "You're waiting for him to come back, aren't you?" Sarah didn't answer. "You think if you stop watching, he'll appear," Clara said gently. Sarah nodded. Clara knelt beside her. "He won't, because you buried him, not with dirt but with truth, and truth is stronger than fear." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Clara reached into her apron and pulled out a small, stitched square of cloth. On it were 3 names: Sarah, Annie, Eli. She handed it to the girl. "What's this?" Sarah asked. "Our family," Clara whispered. "Every stitch says you are ours now." Sarah didn't speak. She just held it. And for the first time in her life, she let someone else be the guard. She leaned into Clara's arms and fell asleep without fear. The snow came early that winter, earlier than it had in 10 years. It fell thick and fast, blanketing the hills in white before the leaves had even finished falling. The world outside their home looked like silence made solid, but inside the house, life finally moved like it had always meant to. It was in the quiet routines where healing planted its seeds, Annie reaching for Clara's hand without flinching, Eli giggling when Samuel lifted him onto his shoulders, and Sarah humming under her breath as she kneaded bread with steady hands. No one said the word family, but it filled the walls just the same. Still, Sarah watched the road. Even when the courts gave Samuel and Clara full guardianship, even when their father didn't show up again, even when the sheriff himself assured them there was no danger anymore, Sarah would linger by the porch before supper, her eyes following every shadow that stretched too far. Trauma doesn't leave on command. It lingers like smoke, hard to hold and harder to ignore. She slept in the room closest to the front door, and no one questioned it. Not even Clara, who'd begun to understand that some things took time, and others took love layered upon love like warmth against bitter cold. Samuel took to teaching the children in the evenings. They didn't go to town school anymore, not because they weren't allowed, but because Sarah didn't want to be that far from the house, from safety. Samuel didn't mind. He taught them to read by lamplight, using the old Bible and a collection of journals from his father. He taught them to count with beans and stones and sticks in the yard. They learned because they wanted to, because learning no longer hurt. One night, after Eli had asked his 10th question in a row, Clara took Samuel's hand and smiled. "They're thriving," she whispered, watching the boy's eyes shine in the lamplight. Samuel nodded. They just needed a home. But that wasn't all they needed. One afternoon, Sarah stood by the fence mending a break in the wood, her hands moving out of habit while her eyes stayed locked on the horizon. Annie was nearby picking dry flowers for the table, and Eli sat on the porch steps with Clara, helping sort dried beans into jars. Samuel had gone into town for supplies. The horse came out of nowhere. The sound of hooves pounding frozen dirt reached Sarah's ears like a thunderclap. She dropped the hammer and turned just in time to see a man on horseback ride straight up their path. He wasn't her father, but he wasn't a stranger either. Tommy Rivers. A cousin, the only family her father ever claimed to like. A man who once drank with him in the same saloon where Sarah had begged Jeb for help. A man who laughed when her father told stories of discipline and raising them tough. He dismounted with a smirk too slick to trust, and a jacket too clean for the trail. "Well, well," he said, looking around, "ain't this cozy?" Sarah stood her ground. "You're not welcome here." "Didn't come to stay," he said, brushing dirt from his trousers. "Just came to collect." "Collect what?" He motioned toward the house with a lazy hand. "My uncle's kids." "They're not his anymore." Tommy tilted his head. "You really think a court's gonna hold when blood comes knockin'? I've got papers too, girl. He signed guardianship to me before he vanished." "That's a lie." He shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. Law doesn't care, just needs ink and a signature." Clara stepped out onto the porch. "Is there a problem?" Tommy smiled wide. "No, ma'am, just family business." Samuel wasn't due back for another hour. Sarah's hands clenched. "You need to leave," she said again. "Sweetheart," he said, his tone condescending. "You may have gotten rid of your daddy, but you don't get to pick your kin." Clara moved between Tommy and the children. Annie stood frozen beside her bucket of flowers. Eli pressed into Clara's skirts, wide-eyed and silent. "I'll call the sheriff," Clara said. "You do that," Tommy said, spitting in the dirt. "But by the time he gets here, I'll be halfway back with those kids. You want blood on your porch or you want peace." That's when Sarah moved. She didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't shout. She walked straight up to him, her eyes never leaving his. "You ever wonder why your uncle never let you near us?" she asked. "It wasn't love, it was shame." Tommy laughed. "Shame from a man like him?" "Yes," she said, "because even he knew you were worse." That stopped his smile cold. "I'll come back with law," he said. "I'll come back with men." Sarah looked him square in the eye. "I'll be here." He mounted his horse again, but he didn't turn immediately. He looked down at her, something mean bubbling just beneath the surface. "You ain't gonna stop this," he muttered. "You're just a little girl." Sarah smiled, not wide, not loud, but it was the kind of smile that meant war had been declared. "I stopped a man once," she said. "I can do it again." He rode off. Samuel returned just after the sky began to darken, and when they told him what happened, he didn't waste a breath. He loaded the rifle, he posted a letter to the sheriff, and he built a second lock on the front door. They slept light that night. Even Eli sensed the shift. He clung to Annie in bed, his thumb tucked against his lip like it had been when he was younger. Annie didn't sleep. Sarah did, but only because Clara sat in the chair beside the door all night, whispering prayers under her breath with a Bible in her lap. Tommy didn't return the next day, or the one after that, but they all knew he would. A man like him didn't make threats for show. In the stillness between days they prepared, not just with locks and shutters, but with love. Clara took Annie to town and bought her a new dress, simple but warm. Samuel made Eli a toy horse from wood scraps and taught him how to paint its tail with berry juice. Sarah began keeping a journal, writing in it every night, recording not fear, but hope. "Dear future," she wrote, "please remember this. Please remember what it feels like to belong." Then a week later the storm came. Not from the sky. From the road. 3 men on horseback, Tommy at the front. Tommy didn't come quietly. He came like a force of pride and petty vengeance wrapped in cheap wool and the stink of liquor. The 2 men beside him looked mean, but not half as hungry as Tommy. Hunger, after all, can gnaw through reason, and Tommy wasn't there to reason. He was there to take. Sarah had seen it in her father's eyes once. That storm of entitlement. That belief that family was a leash and not a bond. She stood at the front gate, shoulders squared as the rider slowed. Clara was inside with the children, all 3 of them huddled near the fireplace with the curtains drawn. Samuel stood beside Sarah, rifle slung over his shoulder, not raised, not aimed, but present. Tommy didn't dismount this time. "I brought company," he said, lifting a sheet of paper and waving it like a flag. "See, told you I had the documents, his signature right there. Your fancy law can't ignore that." Samuel took a step forward. "The sheriff already has the court ruling. You're wasting your time." Tommy smirked. "Ain't my time I'm worried about." He glanced at his companions. One was older, skin weathered like bark, with eyes that darted too much. The other was young, maybe 20, chewing something with slow satisfaction. They didn't look like lawmen. They didn't look like kin. They looked like fists waiting for orders. "You come here to settle this legal?" Samuel asked. "No," Tommy said, spitting into the dirt. "I came to settle it final." The wind picked up then, sharp and sudden, carrying winter's warning. Sarah didn't flinch. "You think if you make enough noise, we'll hand them over," she said. "I think," Tommy said, leaning forward slightly, "you're a scared girl trying to play house with something that doesn't belong to you." Samuel's jaw tightened. "They belong with people who love them." Tommy snorted. "Love, that ain't enough. You ain't blood. You ain't got the right." Sarah didn't look away. "Neither do you." Then Tommy moved to dismount. That's when the shotgun sounded. Not Samuel's. From behind the door, Clara had raised the old double barrel that used to sit above the hearth, the one Samuel hadn't fired in a decade. She stepped out slowly, cradling it in steady hands. Her eyes weren't angry. They were calm, cold. "I won't let you harm these children," she said. The men with Tommy hesitated. They hadn't signed up for this. Tommy noticed. "Don't be stupid, woman," he barked. "You think you can threaten your way out of this?" "No," Clara said, "but I can defend my home." The man chewing stopped. The older one shifted in his saddle. Tommy's bravado cracked. He realized then this wasn't the same place he thought he was riding into. He thought they'd be scared. Instead, he found resolve he couldn't match. He cursed under his breath, kicking his horse to turn. "This ain't over," he spat. "You'll wish it was, but it ain't." And then he rode off. The others followed, though with less speed. The silence that followed was thick with relief and tension both. Clara lowered the shotgun only after the horses disappeared over the hill. Sarah let out a long breath, her fingers trembling now that the danger had passed. Inside, Annie whispered, "Is it safe now?" And Clara knelt beside her and nodded. Eli cried, just a little, just enough to remind them that fear leaves an echo, but Samuel pulled him into his lap and held him close. That night they didn't sleep, not because they feared Tommy would return, but because they finally knew they were willing to protect each other no matter the cost. The sheriff came the next day, papers in hand, rifle on his back, eyes sharp. Samuel told him everything, so did Clara. Sarah gave her statement without flinching. The sheriff nodded through it all, then handed over a new set of documents, this time reinforced with a federal seal, ensuring Tommy Rivers had no legal right to come near those children again. "He shows his face," the sheriff said, "and we put him in chains, simple as that." For the first time, Samuel believed it. Still, peace wasn't a door that stayed open. It had to be kept open, protected, cherished, and the house felt that more deeply than ever. Winter came harder after that. The snow covered the fences and stuck to the windows, and for a while the road into town was blocked, but they were ready. Clara sewed new blankets from old quilts, her fingers cracked but tireless. Samuel taught Annie how to split kindling, her face lighting up with pride when she succeeded. Eli learned to make biscuits by watching Sarah, though most of the dough ended up on his nose. And Sarah, for all her watching and listening and shielding, started writing again. She wrote not just in her journal, but in letters, one to the sheriff, one to the judge who gave Samuel and Clara custody, one to the pastor who'd visited once and said a prayer over the land, and one to herself. It said simply, "You are not your father's shadow, you are your mother's hope." She signed it, sealed it, and put it in the drawer beside her bed. They celebrated Christmas with dried fruit and laughter. No one had much, but the joy wasn't in what was wrapped. It was in who was present. Annie drew a picture of the family, Samuel, Clara, herself, Eli, and Sarah, and gave it to Samuel with a bow made from twine. "It's us," she said shyly. Samuel looked at the crude drawing. He'd never seen himself on paper before. But there he was, smile too wide, beard too scruffy, arms around Clara and the children. It wasn't perfect. It was real. He framed it. That night, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Clara leaned her head on Samuel's shoulder. "You ever think," she murmured, "that maybe all this happened so they'd find us, so we'd find them?" Samuel thought of the empty rooms that once echoed with silence, of the nights he'd prayed without knowing who he was praying for. "I do now," he whispered. Sarah listened from the doorway. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The way she smiled said enough. But peace, like winter, doesn't last forever. Spring brought news. Jeb Whitley had been found. He was a state away, drunk in a holding cell, ranting about a daughter who stole his life, and a man named Samuel who stole his family. And he wanted them back. The sheriff didn't sugarcoat it. "He's coming," he said, "soon as he's out." Samuel felt the chill return, not from the air, but from the weight of knowing some devils don't stay buried. Sarah didn't speak. She just sat on the porch and watched the horizon. That night she wrote another letter. This one she didn't seal. She left it on the table for Samuel to read. It said, "If he comes, I'll face him. I'm not a child anymore. I have a home now. And a family. I'm not afraid of him. I'm afraid of what he thinks he can take. But he can't take what he never gave." Samuel folded the letter and tucked it into the Bible on the mantel. They prepared again, this time with more than locks. They built fences stronger, replaced the window panes, trained the children to run to the cellar if anyone approached. But days passed, then weeks. And Jeb didn't come. Until one night, just before dawn, the sound of hooves returned. This time alone. This time it was him. Jeb Whitley didn't knock. He didn't shout either. The man hadn't come to bluster or bluff. He came to burn bridges and break whatever stood between him and the story he'd twisted in his mind. That he'd been robbed, that his children had been stolen, that someone else had taken what was his. And men like Jeb didn't recognize love when it wasn't branded with their name. The hooves stopped at the gate just as the sun cracked the sky open. Mist hung over the ranch like a veil, the cold stubborn even against the rising light. Inside the house, the children were still sleeping, curled in quilts Clara had sewn herself. Sarah stood at the window, already awake, already waiting. Her fingers curled tight against the curtain edge, breath shallow. Samuel stood behind her. He didn't ask if it was him, he knew. Outside, Jeb sat tall in the saddle, his face hollowed by time and drink and fury that had festered too long. His clothes hung looser than they used to. The once thick beard had gone ragged, but his eyes, those were the same, wild, mean, and hungry for control. "Stay in the house," Samuel said quietly. Sarah turned. "No. You don't need to." "I do." Samuel looked at her, at the steadiness in her jaw, at the girl who had once flinched at shadows and now faced the man who made them. He gave a slow nod. She opened the door and stepped out. The porch groaned beneath her boots. The wind tugged her hair across her face, but she didn't move to fix it. She walked down the steps, crossed the yard, and stopped at the fence. Jeb didn't smile, he didn't sneer. He looked at her the way a man might look at an unfinished job, impatient, unimpressed. "Girl," he said like a curse. Sarah didn't flinch. "You took what's mine," he said, "ran off like a thief." "You threw us away," she replied. "I fed you, kept you, gave you my name. You beat us, starved us, broke things just to watch us flinch." Jeb dismounted slowly. His boots sank into the frostbitten ground. "You don't get to judge me." Sarah stared him down. "I don't have to. You judged yourself every time you chose the bottle over us. Every time you picked anger over kindness. Every time you let your children cry and called it discipline." Behind her, the door opened again. Samuel stepped out. Clara was at the window, watching, and inside, 3 small hearts beat faster, listening. Jeb looked past Sarah to Samuel. "You him." Samuel said nothing. "I ought to gut you for stealing what ain't yours." "She's not property," Samuel said calmly. "She's not a prize, she's a person, and she's home now." Jeb snarled. "She don't get a new life, not while I'm still breathing." "Then stop breathing," Sarah said quietly. Jeb's eyes widened. It wasn't a threat. It was a line in the sand. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't beg. "I'm not yours anymore," she said. "I'm not scared of you, I'm not small, and I'm not going back." Jeb's hands curled into fists. He took a step forward. Samuel's rifle cocked, loud and certain. Jeb stopped. Silence stretched, thick as winter. Then Jeb laughed, a broken, jagged sound. "You think this ends it? You think I care about your fences or your papers?" He leaned close, spittle clinging to his lips. "You're just a little brat playing house with folks too soft to know what you are." Sarah's voice was low. "I know exactly what I am. I'm loved." He stared at her, waiting maybe for fear to crack through, for a stammer, a tremble. He got none. He turned, climbed back into his saddle. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "One day you'll beg me to take you back." Sarah didn't answer. She just watched him ride off, slower this time. Slower because something inside him had been stolen, his power. When he disappeared down the road, she turned to Samuel. "You think he'll come back?" she asked. Samuel nodded. "If he does, we'll be ready." Inside, Eli ran to her, burying his face in her coat. Annie clung to her sleeve, and Sarah knelt, pulling them close. That night they prayed, not for protection, not for fear, but for strength, for the kind of love that holds firm even when the wind howls and the dark tries to creep in. Winter began to thaw. The children began to smile more. Eli started singing again, off-key but loud. Annie took to building tiny houses from sticks outside, claiming she was going to build them a second ranch one day, just in case they needed extra space. Sarah wrote another letter, this time to her mother. She placed it on the windowsill and whispered it into the wind. Clara and Samuel talked of adopting the children officially. Papers were signed. Witnesses called. The judge came to the house himself, and when he left, he smiled and said, "This feels like the right ending." But life wasn't done telling the story. Because one day, as the sun rose golden over the hills, a rider approached. Not fast, not loud, just a quiet rider carrying something wrapped in burlap. Sarah saw her first, a woman not much older than her, with eyes that held a storm and hands that trembled. "I was told to come here," the woman said. "They said you help people, lost people." Samuel nodded. "We try." She untied the burlap. Inside was a baby, thin, too quiet. "My brother ran off. My pa's gone, my mama's dead. I've got nothing but her." Clara stepped forward. "You're not nothing," she said. Sarah took the woman's hand. "You've got us now." The door opened again. The girl's name was Macy. She'd grown up one town over, but the moment she crossed that threshold, arms curled protectively around the baby. It was as if she'd stepped into a world that hadn't once tried to break her. Her dress was torn at the hem, her boots mismatched, her hands blistered from walking for days with barely any rest. But her spine was straight, her jaw set. The baby, named Lark, slept soundly now, despite the weight of silence on her mother's face. Inside the house, Annie peeked around the corner, curiosity lighting her eyes. Eli held back at first, arms folded like he wasn't sure if this new change was another storm or a blessing. But Sarah, who had once stood just as lost on that porch, crossed the room without a word and touched Macy's shoulder. "You're safe," she said. "That's all that matters right now." Macy blinked hard and nodded, but the tears slipped down anyway. Not from fear, but from relief. That was the strange part of healing. Sometimes the peace hurt more than the pain ever did. Clara took the baby from her, gentle and slow. "We've got room," she said. "More than enough." Macy didn't ask questions. She just sat when told, accepted a bowl of warm stew, and breathed like it was the first time her lungs knew how. Outside, the snow melted quicker than expected. Spring crept in like a secret whispered too soon. Samuel repaired the corral, and the children took to chasing chickens, each of them claiming their own despite none belonging to anyone but the ranch itself. Sarah helped Macy wash clothes and taught her how to mend sleeves. In turn, Macy taught Sarah how to calm a colicky baby with soft hums and steady swaying. It wasn't a perfect fit at first. Eli was jealous. He didn't say it, but he didn't have to. He kept a distance from Lark, offering her glances that teetered between resentment and confusion. Samuel sat him down one night, the way a father would, no anger, just understanding. "Your heart's big, son," he said, "but even big hearts feel tight when they're growing." Eli blinked up at him. "She's gonna take Sarah away." Samuel shook his head. "Nobody can take what's meant for you. Sarah loves you. That doesn't change just because someone else needs her too." Eli didn't answer. But later, when Lark woke in the middle of the night crying, he was the one who got up first. He didn't say a word, just rocked her, quiet and clumsy, until she fell asleep again. Macy watched from the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, a look in her eyes like maybe she hadn't lost everything after all. It was near the end of April when trouble came back, not with fists this time, but with questions. A man rode into town claiming to be Lark's grandfather, said he had a right to the child, that Macy was unfit, that she'd abandoned her family legacy by running off. Clara and Samuel were called to the courthouse. Macy stayed behind, eyes wide with panic, clutching Lark like she might vanish. "They can't take her," she whispered. "They won't," Sarah said firmly. "But I don't have papers. I don't have anything." "You have truth," Sarah answered, "and you have us." In court, the man, Walter Finn, was all clean boots and practiced sorrow. Told stories about a troubled daughter, a rebellious streak, a baby born under shame. Said Macy was unstable, that she had a history of leaving and no future worth offering a child. Samuel stood slowly, adjusting his coat. "I was a lawman once," he said, "retired now, but I know lies when I hear 'em." The judge raised a brow. Samuel went on. "That man never looked for Macy until someone told him where to find her. He's not here for the child. He's here to save face, pride." Walter scowled. "You don't know me." "I don't need to. I know her." He gestured toward Macy. She walked 3 towns over with blistered feet and no food just to get her daughter warm. She didn't ask for money. She didn't lie. She didn't even ask for help until we offered it. That's what a mother does. That's what family does. The courtroom was quiet. The judge looked at Walter. "Do you have any proof of relation?" "No, but—" "That'll be all," the judge said. "Case dismissed." Macy collapsed into Samuel's arms outside the courthouse, shaking with more shock than joy. She hadn't dared to believe it would be that simple. "It wasn't," Clara said softly, "but it was right." They rode back to the ranch in the evening light, the air turning gold and soft around them. Lark giggled for the first time that night, a sound like wind chimes caught in warm wind. Eli made a face at her, and she reached for him. "She likes you now," Macy said. Eli shrugged. "She's all right, I guess." But he held her a little longer that time. Later, after the house had gone quiet and the lamps dimmed, Sarah walked the porch, hands in her pockets. Samuel joined her, leaning against the rail. "You're thinking again," he said. "I always am." "What about?" She hesitated. "About how many people we've got now, about how big this little family got." He nodded slowly. "You ever think it's too much?" She shook her head. "No, just wondering how much more love we've still got in us." Samuel smiled. "Seems like every time we give it, we find we had more than we thought." They stood in silence for a while, watching the stars. Behind them, Macy stirred in her room, humming something soft to the baby. Eli snored from the next room. Annie whispered in her sleep, a half-formed story about unicorns and cows and a barn that floated. And far beyond the ranch, out in the stillness of the world that once tried to devour them, another shadow waited, another name whispered on the lips of someone who had once known Sarah's father. Because the past wasn't done yet. It never really was. They were mending fences the next morning when the telegram arrived. It came folded in the gloved hands of a tired post rider who dismounted with a cautious glance at the children playing near the barn. He handed it to Samuel without a word, as though the weight of it needed no explanation. Samuel unfolded it slowly, brows furrowing, eyes scanning the words that had been punched out one letter at a time. "Sarah Cullen, stop. Come to Mansfield Station, stop. Urgent affair involving her father, stop. MATTHWKINCID." The name struck harder than any news of death could have. Matthew Kincaid had been her father's closest friend, and for many years, Sarah's second uncle in every way but blood. She hadn't heard his name in more than a decade, since the night her father's ranch was burned to ash by men who never paid for what they did. She had buried that life in a place no prayers reached, and when Samuel found her, she had been a woman walking without direction. But now the past had tracked her down, found the trail she'd buried under 20 winters and all the quiet joy she'd built in its place. She didn't speak after reading the telegram, just handed it to Samuel, who read it again in silence, his jaw tight. "You want to go?" he asked. "I don't know." The sun rose higher. The fence remained half-mended. Chickens clucked nearby as if none of it mattered. But it did. "I can't leave them," she said finally, voice hushed. "I'll go with you," Samuel said without hesitation. "We'll take Macy and the baby. Eli and Annie can stay with the Wallaces. They'll be fine." Sarah turned to him, uncertain. "It's been so long, Sam." "All the more reason to see what's waiting." By evening she had packed a small satchel. She kissed Annie and Eli goodbye, her arms reluctant to let go. Macy stood beside the wagon, Lark wrapped in a blanket against her chest, worry in her eyes but no questions. If Sarah needed to face whatever was waiting in Mansfield, then she would be beside her. The journey took 3 days, and each night was colder than the last. They stayed in tiny way stations along the trail, often silent, occasionally humming lullabies to lull Lark to sleep when the wind rattled the windows. It wasn't until they arrived at Mansfield Station that the full weight of it came down. Matthew Kincaid was older than Sarah remembered, his beard streaked with white and his left leg replaced by a crude wooden prosthetic. He stood under the porch awning like a statue built by grief, and when he saw her, his face broke into something close to a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You came," he said. "You asked." They didn't hug. They weren't sure if they should. Inside, over tea and nervous glances, Matthew finally told them. "There was a journal," he said, sliding a leather-bound book across the table. "Your father's. I didn't know it survived. I've kept it all these years. There's something you ought to read." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages, her name appearing again and again in handwriting she hadn't seen since she was a girl. "She has her mother's fire. If anything happens to me, I pray she finds peace, not revenge. Samuel's a good man. If only I'd had the sense to let them meet. They'll come again. I can feel it. The land is worth more to them than a man's life." "Why now?" Sarah asked, shutting the book. "Because they're back," Matthew said quietly. "The men who burned it down, they've returned, and they're looking for the deeds. The land was never legally transferred after your father passed. If they find the papers, they'll claim it. But the ranch is gone. The soil is. There's silver in those hills now. They want what your father died protecting." Sarah sat back, the fire in her chest, so long dormant, flared alive. "I'm not going back there," she said. "You might not have a choice," Matthew replied. "They know your name, they'll come looking, if not for the deed, then for silence." Samuel reached for her hand under the table. "We'll handle it together." That night Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, reading her father's journal, remembering a girl who once believed in justice before it was stolen from her. Macy came to sit with her, the baby asleep in her arms. "You okay?" she asked. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I thought I buried all this. Thought if I just stayed quiet long enough, the past would leave me be." "It never does," Macy said gently, "but maybe now it's time to face it." By morning, they were on the trail again. They returned to the ranch under heavy skies. Annie came running, Eli not far behind, his face pale. "They came," he whispered. "Men in black coats, asked questions, didn't stay, but they said they'd be back." Clara's face was grim. "We told them nothing, but they were watching." Samuel didn't waste time. He went to the barn and began preparing the rifles, not to start a fight, but to be ready if one came. Sarah tucked the journal into a locked chest beneath the floorboards. Macy took the children inside and quietly began teaching Annie how to load a pistol. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. Storm was coming. And it wasn't just wind and rain. That night Samuel sat on the porch, eyes on the road. Sarah joined him. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good," he said. "Means you still care what happens." "What if they take it from us?" "They won't." She rested her head on his shoulder. For the first time in years, she felt like the little girl in her father's memory, the one he hoped would find peace, not revenge. And maybe, just maybe, that was still possible. But peace would have to wait. Because the riders were already approaching. Dark shapes against the early dawn. Coming slow. Coming steady. Not for land. Not for silver. But for a reckoning long overdue. The hooves thundered in the distance before they could even be seen. Samuel stood slowly, rifle cradled in both arms, his shadow long and unmoving in the early light. Sarah watched from the window, her heart lurching into her throat. The children were already inside. Macy had corralled them to the cellar and locked the door behind her. Even Annie had understood without a word. It was a different kind of silence that gripped the house now, tense, coiled, like the final breath before a storm broke across the plains. 3 riders, dressed in thick dusters and wide-brimmed hats, guns slung across their backs, their horses foamed at the mouth from a hard ride. They didn't stop at the gate. They rode straight through. Samuel took a single step off the porch and raised one hand, palm outward, not in surrender, in warning. That was enough. The lead rider slowed and dismounted. He was taller than the others, face narrow, eyes black as coal, and he walked with the easy arrogance of a man who'd never been told no long enough to remember what it meant. "You Samuel Cullen?" he asked, voice smooth. "I am. This land in dispute belongs to some late rancher name of Jacob Wren. You know anything about that?" "It was my wife's father's ranch." "Right, and she's got a deed?" "No." "Then the land reverts, by territory law. I got a claim in my saddlebags and men ready to enforce it." Samuel didn't flinch. "You come here to file paperwork or start a war?" The man smiled, "Both." Sarah stepped out then, not because she had a plan, not because she thought she could talk him down, but because hiding wasn't who she was anymore. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'm Sarah Cullen, daughter of Jacob Wren, and I do have a deed. You want it, you'll get it in court, not at the end of a gun." The man's smile faltered just slightly. "I know who you are. You ran, didn't you? Left your old man to burn, while men like me cleaned up what was left." She took one step closer, her hands empty, her voice quiet but stronger now. "I was 10. A silence spread between them like a crack in frozen earth. The wind caught the edge of his coat. One of his men shifted in the saddle. The horses whinnied, nervous. Then Samuel spoke. "This ranch has children. You see that barn? There's a cellar below it, and it's got 5 souls who don't deserve to hear your voice, much less your threats. You want to fight someone, you're looking at him." The rider studied them both, calculated, measured the risks. The ledger in his head didn't like the odds. "We'll be back," he said finally, "with the law." "Bring the law," Samuel said. "We'll be ready." The riders turned. Dusted ground spun beneath their heels as they rode off, faster now, less confident. When they were gone, Sarah fell to her knees. Not from fear, but from release. She had been holding the memory of that night, of the smoke, the screams, the unanswered prayers for 2 decades. And now she wasn't a little girl anymore. She was a mother, a wife, a protector. That night they celebrated not with music or noise, but with peace. They broke bread by lantern light, the children sensing that something had changed but not needing the details. Eli sat beside Samuel, asking if the men would come back. "Maybe," Samuel said, "but so will spring, and so will the rain. Doesn't mean we stop planting." Clara reached across the table and touched Sarah's hand. "You shook while they spoke," she whispered. "I still am," Sarah admitted. "That's how we know it matters." They slept with their windows open, and in the quiet of the night, Sarah crept outside. The moon was low, the stars scattered like salt across the dark. She walked to the old barn and sat beside the grave her father had dug for her mother long ago, back when this place had hope still rooted in the ground. "I stayed, Pa," she said aloud. "I didn't run this time." A breeze answered her. Not a voice. but maybe something close. In the months that followed, the claim never held. The writers tried, of course, documents, intimidation, even a false sheriff who showed up one afternoon and got turned away by every neighbor within 30 miles. No one believed the men. No one supported the claim. The land stayed with the Cullens. Macy took up sewing and began selling dresses to nearby towns. Annie started learning how to read from Sarah, who taught with patience she hadn't known she had. Eli began carving small animals out of wood, lining them up across the mantel. Even Clara, who had never spoken of her past, finally opened up one night over cider. She had lost a child, she said, a boy who had barely drawn breath. Dee thought that wound would never close. But now she had Annie, and Eli, and Macy, and Sarah, and Samuel. Not by blood, but by something deeper. One evening, Lark took her first steps. Everyone had been sitting around the table, talking about fence repairs and a new calf born that morning. And then she just stood, wobbled forward, arms outstretched toward Samuel. He caught her, and then he cried. Not from sadness, not from the weight of all he'd lost, but from the impossible joy of what had grown in its place. They buried the old deed in the garden, not out of fear but reverence. The past had done its part. Now it was time for something new to bloom. Years later, when Sarah and Samuel's hair turned silver and the children had children of their own, the story would still be told. Of a girl who lost everything and stayed anyway. Of a man who opened a door and found a reason to live again. Of a family not born but built, one heartbreak at a time. And of a little ranch in the middle of nowhere where orphans became daughters, wanderers became sons, and love, quiet, steady, undemanding, became everything. 5 years passed. The ranch didn't look the same anymore, not because of change, but because of care. The barn had been reinforced, a second one raised with help from neighbors who had once only waved from a distance. The garden had doubled in size. There were more chickens than anyone could count, and Eli had managed to convince Samuel to build a coop just for doves, which he insisted carried messages from heaven. Samuel let him believe it. Sarah spent her mornings writing. She kept thick journals now, filled with every small triumph of the children they raised. Annie had grown into a young woman who braided her hair tight and read with a hunger Sarah recognized in herself at that age. Eli was tall now, voice cracking, hands always covered in dirt or wood shavings, and more comfortable around animals than people. Macy, no longer just a girl rescued from frost, had become a seamstress in her own right and taught younger girls in town how to stitch. She wasn't silent anymore. And baby Lark, no longer a baby, was the heart of them all. When she laughed, it made Samuel pause, every time, as if sound itself had stopped to listen. The land was quiet now, not because life was easy, but because they no longer feared losing what they had found. Every Sunday, Sarah and Samuel sat under the old tree out back, where the gravestone for her father now stood beside a newer one, a simple wooden cross for the mother she never got to bury properly. Samuel had carved it himself, kneeling in the dirt for hours until the words came. She planted love in her daughter, and it bloomed in strangers. That was the kind of faith they'd come to understand. One not written in sermons or shouted from pulpits, but lived quietly, between bowls of stew, bandaged knees, and lullabies sung over creaky floorboards. On the 5th anniversary of the day Sarah first stepped out of the house to face the riders, the whole ranch gathered under that tree. Not for mourning, for Thanksgiving. Neighbors brought pies. Young men strung up lanterns. Clara, hair white now but eyes sharp, handed out tea with honey. Even the Wallace boys, once skeptical of anything softer than hard work, brought guitars and played into the night. When the stars had scattered high, and most of the little ones had fallen asleep on wool blankets in the grass, Samuel took Sarah's hand and walked her back toward the porch. "You ever think about how it all started?" he asked. She smiled every day. I didn't know what I was doing, he said. You knew enough to say yes when I said I had no deed, but wasn't giving up the land. He chuckled. I didn't fall in love with the land. I know, she whispered. Neither did I. Inside, Eli was still awake, sanding a new carving. Lark had drawn all over the floorboards in chalk, and no one told her to stop. Annie was reading aloud to Clara, whose eyes drooped with sleep, but whose smile stayed steady. Macy had taken over the stove, and the scent of bread filled the home. It was no longer a house of ghosts. It was a house of life. Sarah leaned against the doorway and watched it all. She didn't feel like an orphan anymore. She didn't feel like someone who'd lost everything. She felt like a woman who had found everything worth keeping. Samuel stood beside her, hand in hers, both silent. There were no riders on the road tonight. No deeds to defend. No voices raised in fear. Just a porch, a home, and the unshakable knowledge that they had built something sacred from the broken pieces of sorrow. And it would last, because they had made it together.